The western horizon stretched endlessly before them, painted in hues of amber and gold as the sun began its descent behind the rolling Nebraska plains. It was the summer of 1858, a time when America's untamed frontier beckoned with promises of new beginnings and prosperity. For those brave souls who dared to venture westward, the journey was fraught with peril, where dreams of a better life could vanish in the blink of an eye, replaced by the harsh reality of survival in an unforgiving land. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the extraordinary tale of Rebecca Wilson, a young schoolteacher whose world was shattered in a single blood-soaked dawn, and Thomas Eagle Feather, the Dakota hunter who found her when all she had left was the will to survive. A story of two souls from different worlds, bound together by fate and the courage to defy the darkest aspects of human nature. Rebecca's hands trembled as she clutched the small hunting knife her father had given her before they left Boston. The dried blood beneath her fingernails had turned a deep, russet brown, flaking away as she gripped the wooden handle tighter. 4 days had passed since the attack. 4 days since she had hidden beneath the overturned wagon, pressing her fist against her mouth to silence her screams as death swept through the Henderson wagon train like a merciless plague. The memory replayed in her mind with cruel clarity, the pre-dawn stillness shattered by the first gunshots, followed by screams that would forever haunt her dreams. The Henderson party, 18 families bound for Oregon territory, had made camp in Shadow Creek Valley, a seemingly peaceful haven with sweet grass for the oxen and fresh water from the nearby stream. Rebecca had risen early that morning, slipping, away to gather wildflowers while the camp still slumbered. Her father often teased her about her fascination with the prairie blooms. "Even in the wilderness you find beauty," he would say with affection in his voice. It was this small act of appreciation for beauty that saved her life. The thunderous crack of rifles split the air just as she crested a small rise 100 yards from camp. Rebecca dropped instantly to the ground, her body reacting before her mind could process what was happening. Years spent hunting with her father in the woods outside Boston had taught her to move silently through underbrush. Now that skill kept her alive as she crawled through the tall grass back toward camp, but not far enough to be discovered. From her hidden vantage point, she witnessed the massacre unfold with horrifying clarity. Men in dusty trail clothes, their faces obscured by bandanas, moved methodically through the camp. There was no mercy, not for the men who tried to fight back, not for the women who pleaded, not for the children who ran screaming in terror. Rebecca recognized the leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his temple to his jaw, issuing commands with cold efficiency. He had visited their camp just 2 days prior, claiming to be a scout heading to Fort Bridger. Her father, Dr. John Wilson, had even treated the man's companion for a snake bite. Now, she was alone on the vast Nebraska plains, a place where the sky seemed to press down upon the earth with indifferent cruelty. Her chestnut hair, once neatly braided and pinned, hung in dirty tangles around her pale face. Her blue calico dress was torn at the hem and stained with dust and blood, some her own from scratches acquired in flight, some belonging to her father. After the attackers left, she had crept back to find him, only to discover his body lying beside their wagon, his medical bag still clutched in his lifeless hands. The September wind cut through her clothing like a knife. Even in late summer, the nights grew cold on the plains, and Rebecca knew that exposure could claim her as surely as starvation or the men who had destroyed her world. She had taken what little she could salvage from the massacre site after the raiders departed. A canteen half full of water, her father's hunting knife, a woolen shawl that had fallen between crates during the chaos, and a small pouch of cornmeal that had spilled beneath a wagon. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from thirst and disuse. "Just keep moving." But toward what? Rebecca had no clear destination, only the vague understanding that she needed to find civilization, a settlement, a trading post, another wagon train, anything that represented safety in this vast emptiness. The Henderson wagon train had been following the North Platte River, aiming to reach Fort Bridger before the first snows. But in her panic and confusion after the attack, Rebecca had lost her bearings. Each step was becoming more difficult than the last, her city-crafted boots never intended for such a journey, rubbing raw blisters on her heels that burst and bled with every step. The small hunting knife offered little protection against the wilderness or its inhabitants. As twilight approached on her fourth day alone, Rebecca sought shelter in a shallow ravine, gathering what dry grasses she could find to create some meager protection against the wind. She had no means to start a fire. The matches had been in her father's coat pocket, and Dr. John Wilson's body lay back at the massacre site, his kind eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. John Wilson had been a respected physician in Boston, full of compassion and healer's wisdom. After Rebecca's mother died of influenza 3 years ago, he had convinced his daughter that a fresh start in Oregon was what they both needed. "There's a shortage of doctors and teachers in the West," he had told her. "We can build something meaningful there, Becky." The journey west was to be the beginning of their new life, not the end of everything she had ever known and loved. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by the distant howl of wolves and the constant gnawing fear that kept her heart racing. When dawn broke, Rebecca forced herself to her feet, despite the protests of her aching body. The morning was grey, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds that threatened rain. She allowed herself a small sip from the canteen, rationing what little water remained before steeling her resolve. Her father had always said she had a stubborn streak wider than the Charles River. It was time to prove him right. By midday, the clouds had opened, releasing a steady, cold rain that soaked through her clothing and chilled her to the bone. Rebecca's pace slowed, her boots sliding in the mud, each step requiring more effort than she could afford to expend. Still, she pushed forward, following a gradual downward slope in hopes it would lead to water, a stream or river that might guide her to civilization. It was during a brief respite from the rain that she spotted it, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance, barely visible against the grey sky. Her heart leapt into her throat. Smoke meant fire, fire meant people. People meant either salvation or danger. Rebecca hesitated, debating whether to approach or avoid the smoke. Who might be waiting there? Settlers, soldiers, the very men who had attacked her wagon train? Desperation won out over caution. She would die out here alone. That much was certain. Whatever waited at that fire couldn't be worse than freezing to death in this vast emptiness. She altered her course, heading toward the smoke with renewed purpose. The rain began again, harder now, but she barely noticed, her focus entirely on that distant promise of life. What she didn't notice were the eyes watching her from a ridge, nearly half a mile away. A solitary figure tracked her movement through the rain-swept landscape, reading the story of her desperate flight in the bent grasses and dragging footprints she left behind. Thomas Eagle Feather lowered his brass spyglass and frowned deeply, the lines around his mouth etching concern into his weathered face. The woman was heading straight for a camp of traders whose reputation for cruelty toward both natives and women was known throughout the territory. She was walking from one death into another. Thomas tucked the brass spyglass, a prized possession traded years ago for 6 prime beaver pelts, into the leather pouch at his side. Rain dripped from the brim of the wide-brimmed hat he wore, a reluctant concession to practicality rather than any desire to adopt white men's fashion. Thomas was Dakota of the Mdewakanton band, though he had spent much of the past decade moving between worlds, hunting, trading, occasionally serving as guide for the army when it suited his purposes. His father, a respected elder, had seen the changing winds and insisted his son learn the language and ways of the white settlers. To survive the flood, his father had said, one must know how the water moves. He had been tracking a small herd of elk when he discovered the massacre site 2 days earlier. The brutality of the attack told him immediately it wasn't the work of his people or any other tribe he knew. The bodies had been stripped of valuables, but left otherwise intact. No native warrior would waste such resources. This was the work of white men preying on their own kind, bandits using the convenient excuse of Indian attacks to cover their crimes. He had found her trail leading away from the site, small footprints uneven, clearly made by someone exhausted and frightened. Following her hadn't been a conscious decision, merely an extension of his curiosity and perhaps something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge even to himself. Now, watching her stumble toward danger, Thomas knew he had a choice to make. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Leave her to her fate. After all, she was not his responsibility, not his people, or intervene in ways that could bring him only trouble. The rain continued to fall, washing away any easy answers, leaving only the hard truth that the woman wouldn't survive another night alone on the plains. Thomas stood, adjusted the rifle slung across his back, and began to move. Whatever decision he had just made, even he wasn't entirely sure of his reasons. But as the distance between them closed, he knew that both their fates had just become entangled in ways neither could yet understand. Rebecca's vision blurred as she pushed forward through the tall prairie grass, soaked to the skin despite her woolen shawl. The distant smoke was her only beacon in the gathering dusk. Her legs trembled beneath her, threatening to buckle with each step. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Her clothes clung to her skin, drawing precious warmth from her body with every gust of wind. The small knife clutched in her right hand offered little reassurance, but she gripped it tighter as she approached what appeared to be a clearing ahead. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixing with another scent that made her empty stomach clench painfully. Roasting meat. She paused at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a cluster of scrub oak. Through the branches, she could make out 3 wagons arranged in a rough semicircle. 6 men moved about the camp, rough-looking figures in buckskin and wool. A campfire blazed in the center, where something, perhaps a rabbit, turned on a crude spit. Rebecca hesitated, doubt creeping in where desperation had led. There was something about these men that set off warnings in her mind. Their loud, coarse laughter carried to her hiding spot, along with fragments of conversation that made her skin crawl. Good haul from them wagons. Should have kept one of them women, though. Next time we won't be so hasty. The blood in Rebecca's veins turned to ice. These weren't potential saviors. These were the men who had murdered the Henderson party, her father, everyone she had come to know during their journey west. She began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound when her foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk, but not before dislodging a cascade of raindrops from the leaves above. One of the men turned toward the sound, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Who's there?" he called, voice sharp with suspicion. "Show yourself!" Rebecca froze, terror locking her muscles in place. The man started toward her hiding spot, joined by another who carried a rifle. She knew she should run, but her body refused to obey, trapped between fear and exhaustion. "Check it out, Mills," the second man ordered. "Probably just a deer, but no sense taking chances." The man called Mills drew his pistol and advanced toward the tree line where Rebecca hid. In 20 more steps, he would discover her. In 30, she would be dead, or worse. A sharp whistling sound cut through the Air followed by a dull thud. Mills stopped abruptly, looking down at his chest in confusion. The shaft of an arrow protruded from between his ribs, its fletching trembling with the impact. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only blood emerged, spilling down his chin before he crumpled to the ground. Pandemonium erupted in the camp. The remaining men scattered for cover, grabbing weapons and shouting conflicting orders. Another arrow flew from somewhere to Rebecca's left, missing its target, but sending the bandits into further disarray. "Indians!" one of them yelled. "Take cover!" Rebecca remained motionless, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The bandits' attention was no longer on finding her, but on the new threat. She needed to move, to escape while they were distracted. But which way was safe? A strong hand clamped over her mouth from behind, stifling the scream that rose in her throat. An arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her backward into the deeper shadows beyond the scrub oak. "Be still," a voice whispered in her ear. The English, accented but clear, "or we both die." Rebecca's instinct was to struggle, to fight against this new captor, but the sound of gunfire from the camp made her reconsider. Whoever held her had just killed one of the men responsible for the massacre. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was not an enemy. She allowed herself to be pulled deeper into the woods, moving in a low crouch behind her mysterious rescuer. Only when they were several hundred yards from the camp did he release his hold on her. Rebecca spun around, knife raised defensively, and got her first clear look at the man. He was tall, with broad shoulders and the distinctive copper skin of the native peoples. His black hair was pulled back in a single braid, partially covered by a wide-brimmed hat that seemed oddly out of place with his otherwise traditional appearance. A bow was slung across his back alongside a rifle of European make, but it was his eyes that held her attention, dark, intelligent, and currently regarding her with a mixture of wariness and assessment. "They killed your people," he stated rather than asked, "at Wagon Place 3 suns ago." Rebecca nodded slowly, not lowering her knife. "Yes. How did you—" "Found dead. Saw your tracks." He gestured in the direction they had come. "Those men. Bad men. Not my people who attacked your wagons." "I know," Rebecca whispered, the knife wavering in her grip as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. "I heard them talking. They murdered everyone and blamed it on Indians." The man studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if coming to a decision. "Cannot stay here. They will search when they find courage again." As if to emphasize his point, another shot rang out from the direction of the camp, followed by shouting. The bandits were regrouping, perhaps preparing to hunt down whoever had attacked them. "I'm Rebecca," she said, lowering the knife finally. What choice did she have but to trust this stranger? The man touched his chest. "Thomas?" Then, seeming to reconsider, he added, "White men call me Thomas Eagle Feather." "Thank you," Rebecca began, but her words died as her legs finally gave way beneath her. She crumpled toward the ground, the world spinning around her. Thomas moved with surprising speed, catching her before she could fall completely. "Too long without food, without rest," he observed, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "Need safe place." Despite her situation, despite everything, Rebecca felt a flicker of fear as this native warrior lifted her into his arms as easily as if she were a child. But she lacked the strength to protest, and somewhere in her mind, a voice whispered that, if he had wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. Thomas carried her deeper into the woods, moving with a silent grace that seemed impossible for someone bearing her weight. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them as darkness settled completely over the land. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, awareness coming in fragments, the steady rhythm of Thomas's breathing, the occasional snap of a twig beneath. His feet, the stars appearing one by one through breaks in the canopy above. When she next opened her eyes fully, they were in a small ravine, sheltered by an overhanging rock formation. A tiny fire burned, carefully banked to produce minimal smoke. The warmth it radiated was the first real comfort Rebecca had felt in days. The sensation was so overwhelming that tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. Thomas knelt beside her, offering a water skin. "Drink slow," he instructed. She accepted it with trembling hands, taking careful sips of the cool water. Each swallow felt like life itself flowing back into her parched body. "Why?" she asked when she had drunk her fill. "Why?" "Help me?" Thomas sat back on his heels, considering her question with the same grave intensity he seemed to apply to everything. In the flickering firelight, she could see details she had missed before. A scar that ran along his jawline, the intricate beadwork on the medicine pouch that hung at his belt, the weariness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much. "Many reasons," he answered finally. "None simple." He reached into a leather bag and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. "Eat, sleep. Tomorrow words will come easier." Rebecca accepted the food, tearing off small pieces with her teeth as she'd seen the men of the wagon train do with their jerky. The flavor was unfamiliar but not unpleasant, gamey and smoky. As she ate, Thomas moved to the edge of their small camp, positioning himself where he could watch for any sign of pursuit. His profile against the night sky seemed as much a part of this wild landscape as the trees and rocks that surrounded them. Rebecca wondered at the strange turn her fate had taken. 3 days ago, she was Rebecca Wilson, a schoolteacher's daughter, heading toward a new life. Now, she was a survivor, dependent on the mercy of a man from a world as foreign to her as the moon. Sleep tugged at her heavier with each passing moment. As her eyes drifted closed, her last thought was of how quickly everything could change, how thin the line between life and death, between enemy and ally, between past and future. In her dreams, the massacre played out again and again. But this time, a figure watched from the shadows, a man with dark eyes and a wide-brimmed hat, witnessing her survival with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Dawn broke with a cold, clarity that painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold. Rebecca woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the rock shelter around her and the small fire that had burned down to glowing embers. Memory flooded back in a rush. The massacre, her days alone, the bandits' camp and Thomas Eagle Feather, who had carried her to safety. She sat up slowly, muscles protesting after days of exertion and poor rest. A quick assessment of her surroundings revealed that she was alone. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had Thomas abandoned her? The thought had barely formed when a shadow fell across the entrance to their small shelter. "You sleep like dead," came a voice from the entrance. Thomas ducked inside, carrying a handful of small brownish roots. "Good. Body needs healing." Relief washed over Rebecca, followed immediately by embarrassment at her reaction. "I thought," she began, then stopped herself. A hint of what might have been amusement touched Thomas's eyes. "That eagle feather leaves you." "No!" He knelt by the fire, adding small twigs to coax the embers back to life. "Went to find food, check for bad men. They search still, but go in. Wrong direction. South." While the roots cooked, Thomas produced a small clay pot from his pack and mixed water with some kind of dried herb. The resulting paste he offered to Rebecca, along with a questioning look. She hesitated only briefly before extending her arm, revealing a deep cut just below her elbow that had begun to show angry red lines extending from it. Thomas nodded grimly and began applying the paste with surprisingly gentle fingers. "Infection starts," he explained. "This will fight, but I need more, have medicine at my camp." He finished treating her wound and sat back. "Can you walk today?" Rebecca flexed her feet, assessing the pain in her blistered heels. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. He studied her face for a moment. For you, maybe 4. The implied challenge in his words sparked something in Rebecca, a stubborn pride she had nearly forgotten during her days of desperate flight. "I can keep up," she said firmly. The AEC, ghost of a smile, crossed Thomas's face. "We see." They ate the prairie turnips along with the last of Thomas's dried meat. The food, simple as it was, restored some of Rebecca's strength, though she knew it would take more than one meal to recover from her ordeal. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself confronting a reality she'd been too exhausted to fully consider the night before. She was placing her trust, her life, in the hands of a man whose people were often portrayed as savages in the stories told around settler campfires. Yet this savage had shown more humanity than the white men who had murdered her father and the others. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, as Thomas extinguished the fire with handfuls of dirt. The truth this time. He paused, regarding her with those unfathomable dark eyes. Truth has many sides, like river stones. He seemed to debate with himself before continuing. "I follow tracks from Wagon Place. See you are alone. Hunted." His expression hardened. "Those men, they kill my people too. Say Dakota did it. Use fear of Indians to hide their crimes." Rebecca frowned. "You were tracking them? The bandits?" Thomas nodded once. "For many moons. They raid. They kill. They blame my people. Then white soldiers come to punish innocent villagers." He shouldered his pack. "You are witness. You saw truth. Maybe one day you will speak this truth." The weight of his words settled over Rebecca. She had never considered the consequences of the false attribution of attacks. How many innocent people on both sides had died because of such deceptions? "I will," she promised, her voice strengthening with resolve. "If I live to tell anyone about it." "You live," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "Now we go." They traveled northwest, keeping to ravines and sparse woodland where possible to avoid being spotted. Thomas set a pace that was challenging but not impossible, occasionally slowing when he noticed Rebecca struggling. They spoke little, conversation limited to practical matters, warnings about terrain, brief rests for water, instructions on which plants to avoid. By midday, Rebecca's body had settled into the rhythm of the journey, the consistent movement actually easing some of the stiffness from her muscles. She found herself studying Thomas as they walked, the efficient grace of his movements, the constant awareness he maintained of their surroundings, the way he blended European and native elements in his dress and tools. "You speak English well," she observed during a brief rest beside a small creek. Thomas gave her an appraising look, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Lived at mission school 3 winters, learned white man's words. White man's God." He dipped his hand in the creek, letting the water flow through his fingers. "Learned how white men think. Useful knowledge." "But you left," Rebecca said. It wasn't a question. "Mission wants Dakota to become white inside. Forget old ways." He touched the medicine pouch at his belt. "Some ways should not be forgotten." Rebecca thought of her own education at the ladies' seminary in Boston, where she had been taught that civilization was a gift being bestowed upon the savage races. Now, facing the reality of the frontier, she wondered which world was truly savage. They continued their journey as afternoon shadows lengthened across the prairie. Twice, Thomas froze in mid-step, signaling for Rebecca to be still. Each time, after long moments of listening, he would relax slightly and gesture for them to proceed. She never asked what he had heard or sensed. Some things were better left unknown. As dusk approached, they reached a series of low hills dotted with juniper and pine. Thomas led her to a sheltered hollow where a natural spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a small pool before trickling away downstream. "We rest here," he announced, shedding his pack. "Good water, hidden." Rebecca sank gratefully to the ground, removing her boots to examine her feet. The blisters had broken and resealed several times during the day's journey, creating a painful patchwork of raw and calloused skin. She stifled a groan as she dipped her feet in the cool, spring water. Thomas watched her for a moment, then disappeared into the gathering darkness. He returned shortly with a handful of broad leaves and some white chalky stones. Crouching beside the spring, he crushed the stones to powder and mixed it with the masticated leaves. "For feet," he explained, offering the mixture to her. "Will draw pain out, help skin grow strong." Rebecca hesitated only briefly before applying the paste to her battered feet. The relief was almost immediate, a cooling sensation that dulled the throbbing pain. "Thank you," she said, the words seeming inadequate for all he had done. "You've been—" She searched for the right word. "Kind." Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Is survival. You help me, I help you." "How have I helped you?" Rebecca asked, genuinely puzzled. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression serious in the deepening twilight. "White woman alone on prairie has many enemies. White woman with Dakota hunter has one more, but also has ally who knows both worlds." He gestured to the vast landscape around them. "This country bleeds from fighting between my people and yours. Maybe some must learn to walk between, to find a new path." The weight of his words settled over Rebecca as the first stars appeared overhead. She had lost everything she knew, yet here in this hollow, beside a spring, with a man from a world she had been taught to fear, she felt the first tentative stirring of something unexpected. Not hope, it was too soon for that, but possibility. A future not yet written, one she would have the courage to walk toward, one step at a time. Morning arrived with a layer of frost that glittered on the grass surrounding their camp. Rebecca woke to find Thomas already alert, watching the eastern horizon with a troubled expression. The paste on her feet had dried overnight, forming a protective crust that cracked when she moved. Beneath it, her skin felt less raw, the worst of the blisters beginning to heal. "Storm coming," Thomas said, nodding toward a bank of dark clouds, gathering in the distance. "Bad timing." Rebecca followed his gaze, noting the ominous wall of gray approaching from the northwest. "How far is your camp?" "Still 2 days, maybe more with storms." He handed her a small bundle of dried berries. "Eat. Need strength today." The berries were tart but nourishing, easing the hollow feeling in her stomach. As she ate, Rebecca took stock of herself, the torn dress that hung loosely on her frame after days of little food, the tangled mess of her hair, the dirt embedded beneath her fingernails. She had never been particularly vain, but the physical transformation reflected a deeper change taking place within her. "Can I—" She gestured toward the spring, embarrassed but determined. "I need to wash." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. "I will check trail ahead. Return soon." He gathered his bow and slipped away through the trees, offering her privacy without needing to be asked. Rebecca waited until he was out of sight, then stripped off her filthy dress and undergarments. The water was breathtakingly cold, but she forced herself to endure it, scrubbing at her skin and hair with handfuls of sand from the spring's edge. The simple act of washing away days of grime felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. She had just finished dressing when a sound caught her attention, a snapping twig, too heavy to be Thomas's careful footsteps. Rebecca froze, her gaze darting to where her knife lay beside her discarded boots. A man emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the spring, bearded, wearing a buckskin jacket stained with grease and gunpowder. One of the bandits. His eyes widened when he saw her, surprise quickly replaced by a predatory smile. "Well, now," he drawled, hand moving to the pistol at his belt. "Didn't expect to find a lady taking a bath out here." His gaze traveled over her with open hunger. "You must be the one that got away from the wagons." Rebecca's mind raced. Thomas was too far to hear a call for help. The knife was several steps away. The bandit had a gun. Her options were few and desperate. Mills was right. Thought he heard something before that arrow took him. The man spat on the ground. "Where's your red-skinned friend, The one who's been leaving us little surprises?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm alone." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the rocks. "Sure you are, darling, and I'm the Queen of England." He took a step forward, then another. Rebecca's eyes flicked to her knife, calculating her chances of reaching it before he could draw his pistol. They weren't good. "Blackwell will be mighty pleased when I bring you in," the man continued. "He's been right irritated about losing track of you. Can't have witnesses, you understand." He grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Though I might take some time getting you back to camp. Been a while since I had company as pretty as you." Rebecca felt sick, but kept her expression neutral. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Fear is useful only if it makes you act." She began to inch sideways, trying to angle closer to her knife without being obvious. "You won't make it to that knife, girl," the bandit said, reading her intention. "But I admire your spirit. Makes things more interesting." He was close. Enough now that Rebecca could smell him, sweat, tobacco, and something ranker beneath. She tensed, preparing to make a desperate lunge for her only weapon, knowing it was futile but unwilling to surrender without a fight. The bandit's hand moved to draw his pistol. In that same instant, a shadow detached itself from the trees behind him. Thomas moved with incredible speed, one hand clamping over the man's mouth while the other drove a knife between his ribs with lethal precision. The bandit's eyes widened in shock, his hand frozen halfway to his weapon. A muffled gurgle escaped around Thomas's fingers before the light faded from the man's eyes. Thomas lowered the body to the ground silently, his expression grim as he wiped his blade clean on the man's jacket. He looked up at Rebecca, who stood transfixed by the sudden violence. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Rebecca shook her head, unable to find words. Thomas moved quickly to gather their belongings. "Others will be close," he said. "He was scout. When he does not return, they will search." The immediacy of the danger broke through Rebecca's shock. She snatched up her knife and boots, pulling them on with trembling hands. Within moments they were moving again, heading away from the spring at a rapid pace, leaving the dead bandit behind. "How did you know?" she asked when they had put nearly a mile between themselves and the spring. "Saw his tracks crossing ours. Came back." Thomas's expression was unreadable. Almost too late. Rebecca thought of how close she had come to a fate worse than death, then forced the image away. "Thank you," she said simply. Thomas nodded once, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Storm close now. Need shelter before it breaks." They traveled for another hour as the sky darkened ominously above them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Thomas led them toward a line of bluffs, searching for something specific in the rocky formations. "There," he said finally, pointing to a narrow opening in the stone face. "Cave." The entrance was barely visible, half hidden by scrub and fallen rock. Thomas moved aside some of the debris, creating a passage just wide enough for them to enter single file. Inside, the space opened up, not large, but enough room to sit comfortably and a ceiling high enough to stand. Most importantly, it was dry and protected from the wind. "Good place," Thomas said, setting down his pack. "Hidden, defensible." Then, as if punctuating his assessment, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the entrance, followed seconds later by a tremendous crack of thunder. The storm had arrived. Rebecca sank to the floor of the cave, the events of the morning catching up with her all at once. She watched numbly as Thomas efficiently prepared their shelter, placing stones for a small, smokeless fire, arranging their meager supplies, setting a container to catch water from a small seep at the back of the cave. "You killed him," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the rain now pounding outside. Thomas paused in his work, regarding her carefully. Yes, without hesitation, he would kill you, or worse. There was no apology in Thomas's tone, no regret, merely a statement of fact. Rebecca knew he was right. The bandit had made his intentions clear enough, yet the cold efficiency with which Thomas had ended the man's life reminded her of how little she knew about her protector, how different their worlds truly were. "Have you killed many men?" she asked, unsure why it mattered, but needing to know. Thomas returned to arranging stones around the small fire he was building. "Some in war against the Crow. Some when army attacked our village 3 summers ago. Some, like today, men who would harm others." Ubi, he struck a spark into his carefully prepared tinder, nurturing the tiny flame with practiced care. "Killing is not good, but sometimes necessary." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Your father, he was healer, yes?" Rebecca nodded. Surprised, "How did you know?" "At Wagon place, saw medicine bag, saw how you treat wounds, learned hands." "He was a doctor," she said softly. "He believed all life was sacred." Thomas nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Good belief. But even healer must sometimes cut away poisoned flesh to save the body." He fed another small twig to the growing fire. "Some men are poison to the earth. They spread sickness wherever they walk." The simple wisdom of his words settled over Rebecca. There was truth there, a harsh truth she had been sheltered from in her previous life, but one she was now being forced to confront. In this unforgiving land, survival sometimes required terrible choices. "Your father taught you to heal?" Thomas asked, changing the subject with evident deliberation. Rebecca welcomed the shift. "Some. I assisted him when needed, learned to treat common ailments, set bones." A sad smile touched her lips. "He hoped I would marry a doctor and continue the tradition, but I wanted to teach." Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. "Teach? Children?" "Yes. I was to be the schoolteacher in whatever settlement we joined in Oregon." The dream seemed so distant now, belonging to another life, another Rebecca. "I believe education is what will ultimately bridge the gap between different peoples. That understanding begins with knowledge." "Knowing is good," Thomas agreed, "but many white teachers come to Dakota people, teach our children to forget old ways, say our stories have no value. This is not understanding." Rebecca felt a flush of shame. Her naive belief in the civilizing power of education suddenly seemed presumptuous. "That's not what I meant." Thomas raised a hand to stop her. "I know, your words have truth in them, but truth, like river, flows 2 ways." He stared into the small fire. "Maybe someday, teaching flows both ways. White children learn Dakota wisdom. Dakota children learn white man's knowledge. Then understanding grows." Lightning flashed outside the cave entrance, briefly illuminating the small space where Rebecca and Thomas had taken shelter from the storm. Rain pounded against the earth with relentless fury, turning the ground outside into a treacherous mire. For now, at least, they were safe from both the elements and pursuers. "The man at the spring," Rebecca said, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled between them. "He mentioned someone named Blackwell. Is he their leader?" Thomas nodded, feeding another small stick into their fire. "Marcus Blackwell, former Army scout." knows territory well. His expression darkened. Dangerous man, clever, cruel. He visited our wagon train, Rebecca said, the memory surfacing with painful clarity. 2 days before the attack, he seemed friendly, charming even. My father treated his companion for a snake bite. Snake finds snake, Thomas replied grimly. Blackwell studies places before he strikes, learns weaknesses. Rebecca hugged her knees to her chest, the horror of her narrow escape still fresh. How many men ride with him? Once 15, maybe more, now less. Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to the bough beside him. I have been hunting them slowly, one by one, when they separate from main group. You've been killing them? Rebecca wasn't sure whether to be horrified or impressed by this methodical approach. Justice, Thomas said simply. Army does nothing. Settlers blame Dakota. Someone must stop the bloodshed. He looked at her directly. Your people have law, yes? Courts? Judges? Rebecca nodded. Of course. Dakota have laws too. Different ways, same purpose. Blackwell breaks all laws, yours and mine. He is outcast from both worlds. The frankness of his assessment was oddly comforting. There was a clarity to Thomas's worldview, uncomplicated by the social niceties and moral equivocations that had defined Rebecca's upbringing. The storm will delay them, Thomas continued, turning his attention to practical matters. Water makes tracks harder to follow, gives us time. He glanced toward the cave entrance, where water cascaded down like a curtain, but we cannot leave until morning. Rebecca nodded, feeling the exhaustion of the day's events settling into her bones. The relentless pace of the past few days, coupled with the constant state of fear, had drained her more thoroughly than she had realized. Despite the hard stone floor beneath her and the lingering terror of her encounter with the bandit, she found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. Thomas noticed her struggle. Sleep, he advised. I watch first. You need rest too, she protested weakly. Later. His expression softened slightly. Dakota warriors learn to take sleep in small pieces, like beads on string. Makes whole necklace by morning. Rebecca wanted to argue further, but found herself unable to resist the pull of exhaustion. She lay down on the thin blanket Thomas had provided, using her arm as a pillow, and surrendered to sleep. Her dreams were a chaotic tangle of images. Her father's gentle hands showing her how to dress a wound, the flash of gunfire in the pre-dawn darkness, Thomas's knife sliding between the ribs of the bandit, blood spilling onto parched earth. She woke with a gasp, disoriented and trembling. Bad spirits visit your sleep, Thomas observed from his position near the cave entrance. The storm still raged outside, but the thunder had moved farther away, rolling across the prairie in increasingly distant waves. Just dreams, Rebecca said, sitting up and pushing her tangled hair from her face. Memories, really. Thomas nodded in understanding. Memory spirits are strongest. They know true fears. Despite her rationalist upbringing, Rebecca found comfort in his animistic explanation. There was something almost tangible about the weight of memory, the way it haunted the edges of consciousness like a restless ghost. You should sleep now, she said, noting the weariness in his posture. I can keep watch. To her surprise, Thomas acquiesced without argument, perhaps recognizing his own limits. He settled himself on the hard ground, his back against the cave wall, knife close at hand. Within moments, his breathing had deepened and slowed, though Rebecca noted how his body remained poised for immediate action even in sleep. It was the rest of a predator, alert to danger even in repose. Left alone with her thoughts, Rebecca found herself studying her unlikely protector. In the soft glow of the dying fire, the hard lines of his face had softened, revealing a man younger than she had initially thought, perhaps no more than 30. The scar along his jaw spoke of violence survived, while the careful way he addressed her wounds bespoke compassion and knowledge. He was a contradiction to everything she had been taught about Indians in her Eastern schooling. There, native peoples were portrayed either as bloodthirsty savages or as noble but primitive children of nature, in need of civilization's guiding hand. Thomas Eagle Feather was neither. He moved between worlds with a pragmatic adaptability, taking what served him from each culture while maintaining his core identity. Rebecca wondered what he truly made of her, this bedraggled, helpless white woman who had stumbled into his carefully orchestrated campaign against Blackwell's band. Was she merely an inconvenience, a complication in his mission of justice? Or did he see in her a potential ally, someone who could testify to the truth if they reached civilization? The questions circled in her mind as she maintained her vigil, listening to the storm gradually subside to a gentle patter against the earth. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion reclaimed her, and she dozed off despite her best intentions. She woke to Thomas's hand on her shoulder, gentle but insistent. Daylight filtered through the cave entrance, weak but persistent. The storm had passed. "Time to move," he said simply, already gathering their few belongings. "Ground soft, but good for us. Hides tracks better." Rebecca rose stiffly, her body protesting each movement. The hard floor had done her already battered frame no favors. Still, the infected cut on her arm looked better this morning. The angry, red streaks receded, and her feet felt stronger thanks to Thomas's remedy. They emerged from the cave into a transformed landscape. The prairie grasses lay flattened by the deluge, and small streams had formed where previously there had been only dry earth. The air felt cleansed, carrying the scent of wet soil and growing things. Thomas surveyed the horizon with practiced eyes. "Good," he declared after a moment. "No smoke, no signs of men." He pointed northwest. "My people's camp is there, 2 days' hard walk." They set off at a steady pace, making good progress through the rain-washed terrain. Thomas remained vigilant, periodically stopping to check for signs of pursuit or to reorient himself using landmarks invisible to Rebecca's untrained eye. By midday, they had covered considerable ground, the bluffs where they had sheltered becoming distant shapes on the southern horizon. During a brief rest beside a rain-swollen stream, Rebecca ventured a question that had been forming in her mind since dawn. "Your people, will they welcome me?" The implicit "or will they kill me" remained unspoken, but hung in the air nonetheless. Thomas considered her question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. Some yes, some no. He met her gaze directly. Chief Grey Wolf is wise man, but cautious with white settlers, too many broken promises. "I'm hardly a settler now," Rebecca said with a wry smile, gesturing at her disheveled state. A glimmer of appreciation for her humor flickered in Thomas's eyes. "Truth," he acknowledged, "but still, prepare for difficult welcome. Stay close to me." They resumed their journey, angling slightly west to follow a game trail that Thomas deemed safer than the more direct route. As they walked, he began pointing out features of the landscape that would have escaped Rebecca's notice. The nearly invisible track of a deer they followed, plants that could be eaten or used for medicine, signs of animals that had passed recently. "There," he said, indicating a patch of disturbed earth beneath an overhanging ledge. "Badger den, good sign." "Why is that good?" Rebecca asked, seeing nothing remarkable about the burrow. "Badger chooses safe places, where food, water close, where larger predators do not hunt." He tapped his temple. "Badger smart. We learn from badgers." Rebecca found herself absorbing these lessons eagerly, filing away knowledge that would have seemed irrelevant in her previous life, but now might mean the difference between survival and death. There was a strange freedom in this new existence, stripped of social conventions and expectations, reduced to the essential business of staying alive. As the day waned, they approached a series of rolling hills that marked the transition from open prairie to more varied terrain. The vegetation grew denser, stands of cottonwood and willow appearing along the small watercourses that cut through the landscape. Thomas became more alert, scanning their surroundings with increasing frequency. "We enter hunting grounds of my people," he explained when Rebecca questioned his heightened vigilance. "Dakota scouts watch borders. Must be careful they do not mistake us for enemies." The possibility of being shot by Thomas's own people added a new layer of anxiety to Rebecca's already strained nerves. She found herself studying every shadow, every movement in the distance, imagining hidden observers tracking their progress. As twilight began to settle over the land, Thomas led them to a sheltered hollow between two hills, where they would make camp for the night. He worked efficiently to construct a small fire pit, building a fire that produced minimal smoke. Rebecca assisted as best she could, gathering the driest twigs and arranging their meager bedding. "Tomorrow we reach village," Thomas said as they sat beside the small fire. "Before entering, I must prepare you." Rebecca nodded, bracing herself for whatever warnings or instructions might follow. "When we arrive, many will speak harsh words, show anger." His eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "Do not react, do not show fear." "Why would they be angry with me?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thomas's expression grew solemn. "Your people push Dakota from ancestral lands. Soldiers kill our warriors, our women, even children. Treaties made, treaties broken." He sighed, a rare display of emotion. "Hard for some to see past this when they look at white face." Rebecca felt the weight of this history. A history she had been taught from a very different perspective, if it had been mentioned at all in her Eastern education. "I understand," she said quietly. "I give protection," Thomas continued, "but you must be strong yourself." There was something in his tone that caught Rebecca's attention, a personal concern that went beyond mere practicality. She wondered, again, what she represented to him, why he had chosen to involve himself in her fate. Thomas reached into the small medicine pouch he carried and withdrew an object wrapped in soft leather. Unwrapping it, he revealed a carved stone figure, a bear, small enough to fit in her palm, polished to a dull sheen by years of handling. "My father made this," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Protection spirit. Bear you killed gives strength. This gives—" He searched for the word, "belonging." Rebecca closed her fingers around the small carving, deeply moved by the gesture. "I can't take this. It was your father's. Now it's yours," he said firmly. "Keep close. When afraid, remember bear fell by your hand. You earned place." The weight of the small stone in her palm felt somehow significant, a tangible connection to Thomas's world, a talisman against the unknown challenges ahead. She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, feeling its reassuring solidity against her hip. They finished their simple meal in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts as darkness settled completely over the prairie. Rebecca found herself wondering what the next day would bring, whether she would find sanctuary among Thomas's people or face rejection. The uncertainty of her future stretched before her like the vast, star-filled sky overhead, both terrifying and filled with possibility. Sleep came more easily than she expected, her body's demands overriding the anxiety of her mind. Her last conscious thought was of the carved bear, a symbol of strength and belonging in a world where she had lost both. The dream came without warning, vivid and terrifying. She was back at the Henderson wagon train, watching helplessly as Blackwell's men moved through the camp, systematically destroying everything in their path. But this time she wasn't hidden in the grass. She stood in plain sight, frozen, unable to run or hide, as Marcus Blackwell himself approached her. That charming smile now twisted into something monstrous. "Did you think you could escape me, Miss Wilson?" he asked, raising his pistol to her face. "Witnesses are such an inconvenience." She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. The pistol's barrel seemed to grow larger, becoming a black void that would consume her entire existence. "Rebecca." The voice came from somewhere beyond the dream, insistent and familiar. "Rebecca, wake." She jerked awake with a gasp, disoriented and terrified. Thomas knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, his expression concerned in the dim light of the dying fire. "Bad spirits again," he observed, removing his hand when he saw she was fully awake. "I saw him, Blackwell," Rebecca whispered, the dream's terror still clinging to her like a cold sweat. "It felt so real." Thomas nodded gravely. Dreams sometimes showed danger coming. Dakota believed this. He glanced toward the eastern horizon, where the faintest lightening of the sky heralded approaching dawn. "We leave soon. Better to reach. Village in morning light." Rebecca rose, grateful for the distraction of practical matters. They broke camp quickly, erasing all signs of their presence before setting off just as the first streaks of pink and gold appeared on the horizon. The landscape changed subtly as they traveled northward. The rolling hills became more pronounced, and stands of timber appeared with increasing frequency. Thomas pointed out a distant creek winding through the valley ahead, explaining that it led toward the larger river near which his people had established their summer camp. "We are watched," he said casually, as they descended a gentle slope toward the creek. Rebecca tensed, scanning their surroundings, but seeing nothing unusual. "How do you know?" "Birds flew up from trees ahead, wrong pattern." He continued walking at the same steady pace. "Dakota scouts. Good sign, means village still there." Despite his reassurance, Rebecca felt exposed, imagining unseen eyes tracking their every movement. They crossed the creek at a shallow ford, the cool water refreshing against her ankles. As they climbed the opposite bank, Thomas suddenly raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. He stood perfectly still, head slightly cocked as if listening for something beyond her perception. After a long moment, he relaxed marginally. "They come," he said, his voice low. "3 warriors. Stay calm. Speak only if spoken to." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs, but she nodded, determined to follow his instructions. They waited in silence as the minutes stretched painfully. Then, as if materializing from the landscape itself, 3 mounted figures appeared on the ridge ahead of them. The Dakota warriors were nothing like the caricatures Rebecca had seen in illustrated papers. These men carried themselves with a quiet dignity, their faces painted with red and black markings that made their expressions impossible to read. They wore buckskin leggings and minimal upper garments despite the morning chill, their muscled torsos testament to lives of physical prowess. 2 carried bows with arrows nocked but not drawn, while the third, slightly older than his companions, held a rifle of European make. The warriors approached slowly, their horses stepping carefully down the slope. They halted about 20 paces away, studying Rebecca and Thomas with guarded expressions. The one with the rifle spoke first, his words in Dakota bearing the cadence of a formal challenge. Thomas responded in the same language, his hands held slightly away from his weapons in a non-threatening gesture. The exchange continued for several tense moments, voices low, but intensity clear even to Rebecca, who couldn't understand the words. Finally, the warrior with the rifle switched to heavily accented English, directing his words at Rebecca. "Why you come here, white woman?" Rebecca stepped forward, grateful that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I survived a massacre. Thomas saved my life. The warrior's eyes narrowed. Massacre by who? White men, bandits who attack both your people and mine, then blame Indians for their crimes. A flicker of surprise crossed the warrior's face before his. Expression hardened again. You witnessed this? Yes, Rebecca said firmly. I saw everything. I can testify to the truth. The three warriors exchanged glances. The one with the rifle spoke again to Thomas, who nodded and replied. After another moment of consideration, the warrior gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. Chief must hear this, he said. You come. But his gaze fixed on Rebecca with unmistakable warning. You walk with blind eyes. Thomas turned to Rebecca, his expression conveying the seriousness of the situation. They fear you will learn, path to village, for protection. I understand, Rebecca said, though the prospect of being blindfolded in this unfamiliar wilderness sent a surge of anxiety through her. The warrior produced a strip of woven cloth. Thomas took it from him and approached Rebecca. Trust me, he said quietly, for her ears alone. No harm comes while I guide. Rebecca nodded, closing her eyes as he placed the cloth over them, tying it securely at the back of her head. The sudden darkness was disorienting, heightening her other senses. The scent of pine, the sound of wind through branches, the murmur of voices in a language she couldn't understand. She felt Thomas's hand, close around hers, his grip firm and reassuring. Men just don't notice us noticing. This drew a small chuckle from Thomas, a sound Rebecca realized she had never heard from him before. The brief moment of lightness felt precious amid the tension of their situation. They ate the stew, a rich mixture of venison, wild onions, and unfamiliar roots, in companionable silence. Rebecca found herself studying the interior of the lodge, noting the craftsmanship of the structure, the practical arrangement of the sparse belongings. What happens tomorrow? She asked finally. Council meets. You tell story, full story, every detail. They decide if truth or lie. And if they decide I'm lying. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Sleep, he said instead. Need strength for tomorrow. Rebecca lay down on the buffalo robe, its musky scent oddly comforting after days in the wilderness. Exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind raced with anxiety about the coming day. Her testimony before the council would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future relationship between the Dakota and nearby settlers. Thomas, she said softly into the darkness, thank you for bringing me here, for trusting me. There was a long pause before he replied, you trusted first, following Dakota warriors into unknown land. I had no choice. Always choice, he countered. Could have gone to soldiers, chosen safety of your own people. Rebecca considered this. He was right, of course. She had made a choice when she decided to continue with him rather than seek out an army patrol, a choice that had led her here, to this lodge, to tomorrow's testimony. Sleep, Thomas said, his voice already heavy with approaching slumber. Tomorrow comes soon. Despite her anxiety, Rebecca found herself drifting off, lulled by the unfamiliar sounds of the Dakota camp. Distant voices, the occasional laugh or cry of a child, dogs barking at something in the night. Different from the sounds of Boston, different from the wagon train, yet somehow containing the same essential human elements. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a strange one. That perhaps the distance between her world and Thomas's was not as vast as she had once believed. Morning arrived with a soft touch on Rebecca's shoulder. She opened her eyes to find a young woman, Singing Bird, Thomas's niece, kneeling beside her sleeping pallet. The girl's dark eyes were serious, but not unfriendly, as she offered a small wooden cup of steaming liquid. Drink, she said, her English surprisingly clear. Give strength for counsel. Rebecca sat up, accepting the cup with murmured thanks. The tea was bitter but invigorating, clearing the fog of sleep from her mind. She glanced around the lodge to find that Thomas was already gone. "Where is your uncle?" she asked. "Speaks with elders," Singing Bird answered, setting out a clean dress, simple in design but carefully made from soft buckskin. "You wear this. Your dress." She gestured at Rebecca's torn and stained clothing with a slight grimace. Rebecca hesitated, touched by the unexpected kindness, but uncertain about adopting Dakota dress before the council. Would it seem presumptuous? An attempt to curry favor? Singing Bird seemed to read her thoughts. Council respects clean appearance, shows respect back. She pointed to Rebecca's matted hair. "I help with this too." Recognizing the wisdom in the young woman's advice, Rebecca accepted the dress and allowed Singing Bird to help her wash and comb her tangled hair into a simple braid. The transformation was remarkable. The buckskin dress fit surprisingly well, and the simple act of being clean again restored something of her dignity. "Thank you," Rebecca said when they had finished. "This is very kind." Singing Bird shrugged, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Uncle says you are brave woman, shot bear to save him." She touched the bear claw necklace she wore. "Bear spirit strong in you now." Before Rebecca could respond, the hide covering the lodge entrance was pulled aside. A stern-faced warrior, one of those who had escorted them to the camp the previous evening, gestured for her to follow. "Council waits," he said gruffly. With a deep breath and a final grateful nod to Singing Bird, Rebecca stepped out to face whatever judgment awaited her. The council lodge stood at the center of the camp, larger than the others and marked with totemic symbols painted on its exterior. As Rebecca approached, flanked by her stern warrior escort, she could see that a significant gathering had already assembled inside. The morning sunlight filtered through the smoke hole at the top, casting dappled patterns across the assembled faces. Chief Grey Wolf sat at the head of the circle, his weathered face impassive. To his right was the scarred elder who had argued against her the previous evening, his single eye regarding her with undisguised suspicion. To his left, the man with the bear claw necklace nodded slightly as she entered. As she entered, Thomas stood to one side, his posture formal, face carefully neutral. He did not acknowledge her directly, but his presence provided a measure of reassurance. "Come forward," Chief Grey Wolf instructed, gesturing to the center of the circle. "Sit here." Rebecca took her place on the woven mat indicated, conscious of the many eyes upon her. Women of the tribe had gathered at the periphery of the lodge, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Among them, she spotted Singing Bird, who offered an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "You claim to witness attack on Wagon train," Grey Wolf began without preamble. "Tell us what you saw, every detail from beginning." Rebecca took a deep breath, centering herself. This was perhaps the most important story she would ever tell. Lives, both Dakota and settler, might depend on her ability to convey the truth convincingly. "We were part of the Henderson Wagon train," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Bound for Oregon Territory. Families mostly, the Hendersons, the Millers, the Prestons. My father, John Wilson, and I joined in independence." She described the journey. 6 weeks on the trail, the crossing of the Missouri River, the gradual shift in landscape as they entered the plains. Then, in careful detail, she recounted the morning of the massacre, the pre-dawn stillness, her early rising to gather wildflowers, the first shots that shattered the peace. "I was 100 yards from the nearest wagon when I heard the first shots," Rebecca continued, forcing herself to relive the terrible moment. "I dropped to the ground immediately. From where I lay hidden in the tall grass, I could see everything." Her voice remained steady as she described the horror of what followed. The methodical way the attackers moved through the camp, the distinctive appearance of their leader, Marcus Blackwell with his temple-to-jaw scar, the English language they spoke among themselves, the white men's curses they used. They were white men, she emphasized. Some wore pieces of native dress, feathers, beaded strips, but it was obviously false, a disguise. The one-eyed elder leaned forward. "How you survive when all others die?" "I was already away from camp when the attack began," Rebecca explained. "I hid in the grass, then under an overturned wagon. They were careless, confident no one had escaped, more interested in looting than searching thoroughly." She described her days alone, the desperate flight through unfamiliar territory, finally encountering the same men at their camp. "I heard them talking," she said, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "They spoke of the good haul from the wagons. One said they should have kept some of the women. Another said, next time we won't be so hasty. They were the same men who attacked us, not Indians, as they wanted it to appear." The council members exchanged glances. The man with the bear-claw necklace spoke in Dakota to Grey Wolf, who nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Rebecca. "These men, you know who they are?" Rebecca shook her head. "I never saw them before the attack, but they seemed familiar with the territory. They mentioned a trading post to the east where they could sell the stolen goods." "Peterson's outpost," Thomas interjected, speaking for the first time. Several heads turned toward him. "Only trading post 3 days' ride east, known to deal with stolen goods." Grey Wolf's expression darkened. "Peterson man has brought much trouble, buys furs from Dakota land, claims we steal from white trappers." The one-eyed elder, Running Wolf, spoke rapidly in Dakota, gesturing emphatically. Though Rebecca couldn't understand his words, the meaning was clear. He remained unconvinced, suspicious of her account. "Running Wolf asks why we should believe you," Grey Wolf translated. "Says white woman would say anything to save herself." Rebecca felt a surge of frustration, but kept her voice measured. "What reason would I have to lie? If I wanted to blame your people for the massacre, I would have gone to the soldiers. I would not be here, alone among you, telling a story that places blame on my own kind." This caused a murmur among the gathered council. The logic of her argument was difficult to refute. "There is more," Thomas said, stepping forward slightly. "Woman could have joined soldiers. Choose to continue with me instead. Choose truth over easy path." Running Wolf spoke again, his tone challenging. Thomas responded with equal intensity, and soon multiple voices joined the debate, the Dakota language flowing too rapidly for Rebecca to follow any of it. Grey Wolf raised his hand, silencing the council. "One more question," he said to Rebecca. "These men who attack, how many?" "I saw 6, clearly," she replied. "There may have been more. Their leader was a tall man, with a long scar across his cheek, red hair. He wore a black hat with a silver band, called himself Blackwell." A shocked silence fell over the council. Rebecca looked up to find every face staring at her with new intensity. "You know him," she said slowly, recognizing the reaction. "Who is he?" Grey Wolf exchanged glances with the other elders before answering. "Man you describe is Marcus Blackwell, once Army Scout, now," he searched for the English word, "outlaw. He led attack on Dakota hunting party 1 moon ago. Killed many, including my nephew." "My cousin's husband," Thomas added quietly. "His son too." Rebecca turned to him, understanding dawning. This was why he had been tracking the bandits, why he had been so quick to help her. Their paths had converged through shared tragedy. "Blackwell claims Dakota attacked settlers," Grey Wolf continued. "Army believes, sends soldiers, threatens war if raids continue." "But it's not your people raiding," Rebecca said, anger kindling within her. "It's Blackwell and his men creating conflict for their own profit." "Yes, the chief confirmed grimly. But who believes Dakota word against white man's? Even with peace treaty, white soldiers are quick to blame, slow to listen. The elder, with the bear claw necklace stone hand, spoke at length, his tone measured but forceful. Others joined in, the debate resuming with new urgency. Rebecca watched their faces, wishing she could understand their words, but reading much in their expressions and gestures. Finally, Grey Wolf called for silence once more. He studied Rebecca thoughtfully before speaking. "Council believes your words carry truth," he announced. "Story fits with what we know of Blackwell." His expression grew troubled. "What we do not know is what to do with you now." Rebecca hadn't considered this question. In focusing on convincing the council of the truth, she hadn't thought beyond that immediate goal. "I want justice," she said firmly. "For my father, for the others who died, for your people who have been blamed for Blackwell's crimes." "Justice are defined on frontier," Grey Wolf replied. "White law does not listen to Dakota, and white woman who lives with Dakota." He shook his head. "White law does not listen to her either." The truth of this statement settled heavily in the lodge. Rebecca was caught between worlds, no longer fully part of white settler society, not truly accepted among the Dakota. Her testimony would be dismissed or discredited in both courts. There must be a way, she insisted. Someone who would listen, who would have the authority to investigate Blackwell's gang. Thomas, who had been silent during the latter part of the council, stepped forward. "There is one, Major William Bradford at Fort Bridger. Man of honor, has worked for fair treatment of both peoples." Several council members nodded in recognition of the name. Even Running Wolf, the suspicious one-eyed elder, grunted what sounded like grudging agreement. "Bradford knows Dakota speak truth," Grey Wolf confirmed. "But Fort Bridger many days' journey. Dangerous path." "I'll go," Rebecca said without hesitation. "I'll testify to what I saw." Her declaration caused another stir among the council. Thomas's expression remained guarded, but something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps or concern, possibly both. Grey Wolf conferred briefly with the other elders before turning back to Rebecca. "Council will consider this path. Until decision is made, you stay in camp, learn our ways." His gaze was penetrating. "Show if you truly stand for truth or only for your own survival." With that, the council session ended. The elders rose, filing out of the lodge with measured dignity. The women followed, many casting curious glances at Rebecca as they departed. Thomas approached her as the lodge emptied. "You did well," he said quietly. "Council rarely believes outsiders so quickly." "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional strain of reliving the massacre. "Now we wait. Council debates, decides." He offered his hand to help her rise from the mat. "And you learn what means to live among Dakota." As they stepped outside into the bright midday sun, Rebecca realized that a new chapter of her journey was beginning. The testimony was over, but the greater challenge, finding her place in this unfamiliar world, was just beginning. The days that followed transformed Rebecca in ways she could never have imagined. While the council deliberated on the matter of Fort Bridger, she found herself immersed in the daily rhythms of Dakota life. Not as a guest or observer, but as a participant. Under Singing Bird's patient guidance, she learned to prepare hides, to weave baskets from river reeds, to identify plants with medicinal properties. The work was physically demanding, but Rebecca found unexpected satisfaction in these practical skills. Her hands, once suited only for needlepoint and piano keys, grew stronger and more capable. Some of the women continued to regard her with suspicion, but others gradually accepted her presence, offering corrections to her technique or small nods of approval when she completed a task successfully. The elderly White Cloud took a particular interest in her education, demonstrating which roots could be eaten, which berries were poisonous, which herbs would reduce fever or fight infection. She lost daughter to white man's sickness. Singing. Bird explained when Rebecca asked about the old woman's attention. Maybe you were sent to learn her knowledge before she joins ancestors. Throughout these days of learning, Thomas remained a distant figure. She saw him in council meetings, training with younger warriors, departing on hunting expeditions. When their paths did cross, he acknowledged her with a nod or brief greeting, but the easy companionship of their journey seemed to have evaporated within the confines of the camp. On the fifth evening, as Rebecca sat alone outside her lodge, watching the sunset, Thomas finally approached. He settled beside her on the fallen log, watching the western horizon with her in companionable silence. After several minutes, he spoke. Council finishes discussion tomorrow. Decision comes about Fort Bridger. Rebecca's heart quickened. Have they given any indication of their thinking? Divided. Some say risk too great. Blackwell's men watch trails. Army patrols suspicious of Dakota. He glanced at her. Others say truth must be told, no matter danger. I still wish to go, she said without hesitation. For justice, for your cousin's family, for mine. A moment of silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way their recent interactions had not been. Why have you been avoiding me? Rebecca asked finally, the question that had been troubling her for days. Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral, not avoiding, giving space. Here you are, white woman in Dakota camp, different from woman alone in wilderness. He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. Some watch how I treat you. Judge both of us by this. Understanding dawned slowly. Their closeness on the journey, born of necessity and shared danger, carried different implications within the social structure of the camp. Thomas's position, his respect among his people, could be compromised by appearing too attached to an outsider. I see, Rebecca said softly. I wouldn't want to cause problems for you here. Not problem, Thomas corrected. Complication. Different. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion at the camp's edge. Warriors were gathering, weapons in hand, responding to something beyond Rebecca's view. Thomas rose immediately, alert and tense. Stay here, he instructed, already moving toward the disturbance. Rebecca hesitated only briefly before following at a discreet distance. Whatever was happening might affect her as well, and she was tired of being sheltered from difficult truths. At the camp's perimeter, a small group of warriors surrounded. A kneeling figure, a white man, bloodied and bound, his face a mass of bruises. Chief Grey Wolf stood before him, expression grave, as Running Wolf reported something in rapid Dakota. Found near Wolf Creek, Thomas translated quietly for Rebecca, who had come to stand beside him despite his instructions. Watching camp, when caught, tried to fight. The captive raised his head, revealing a face that made Rebecca gasp with recognition despite the injuries. She knew him, one of Blackwell's men, the youngest of the bandits she had glimpsed at their camp. Grey. Wolf turned at her reaction. You know this man? Yes, Rebecca confirmed, stepping forward. He was with the bandits, one of Blackwell's gang. A ripple of tension passed through the gathered Dakota. The captive's eyes widened as he recognized Rebecca. You're dead, he rasped, disbelief evident beneath his fear. You died in the wagons with the rest. Clearly not, Rebecca replied coldly. Unlike my father, unlike the children your gang murdered. Grey Wolf addressed the captive in halting English. Why you watch our camp? The young bandit's gaze darted between the armed warriors surrounding him. Blackwell sent me, he said, desperation loosening his tongue. Said to find the Indian who's been picking us off, the one who took Mills with an arrow, and to look for any survivors from the wagon train. How did Blackwell know to look here? Thomas demanded. Army patrol, the captive replied. They reported seeing a white woman with a Dakota brave heading north. Blackwell figured it had to be the one that got away. Rebecca felt a chill run through her. Blackwell knew she had survived, knew she was a witness to his crimes, and now knew exactly where to find her. Grey Wolf spoke rapidly to the council members who had joined the gathering. The debate was brief but intense, concluding with a sharp nod from the chief. Take him to Council Lodge, he ordered. We learn what else he knows. As the warriors hauled the captive away, Grey Wolf turned to Rebecca and Thomas. This changes path ahead. Blackwell now hunts both of you, knows you can tell truth of his crimes. All the more reason to reach Fort Bridger, Rebecca argued, before he silences us permanently. Grey Wolf studied her with newfound respect. You have courage of Dakota woman, even in white skin. He glanced at the darkening sky. Council meets now, not tomorrow. Decision cannot wait with enemy so close. The chief strode toward the council lodge, calling for the elders to join him. Thomas moved to follow, then paused, turning back to Rebecca. Stay in your lodge, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument this time. Posts outside. I will return when council finishes. Rebecca wanted to protest, but recognized the genuine concern in his eyes. This was not about keeping her away from tribal matters, but about protecting her from very real danger. She nodded her agreement and headed back to her small dwelling, her thoughts racing with the implications of the scouts' capture. The council's deliberations lasted well into the night. When Thomas finally entered her lodge, his expression was grave in the dim light of the small fire. Council has decided, he said without preamble, settling cross-legged before the fire. What will happen? Many things. Thomas added a small stick to the fire, watching the flames catch. Camp moves at dawn, deeper into Dakota territory. Harder to find. Women, children, and elders go north to summer hunting grounds by Great Lake. And us? Rebecca asked, noting his phrasing. Thomas met her gaze directly. We go to Fort Bridger. You, me, 4 warriors. Try to reach Major Bradford before Blackwell finds us. Relief and anxiety washed through Rebecca in equal measure. The council had agreed to her plan, but the journey would be perilous, with Blackwell actively hunting them. When do we leave? Before dawn. Secret path. Need to travel light, fast. Thomas produced a small bundle from his pack. Brought these for journey. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal moccasins made of soft deer hide, decorated with subtle beadwork. Singing bird made for you. Better than boots for quiet travel. Rebecca accepted the gift, touched by the young woman's thoughtfulness. Please thank her for me. Thank yourself. She says you learn well for white woman. A hint of amusement flickered in Thomas's eyes. High praise from Dakota girl. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, packing only essential supplies, reviewing the route they would take, discussing contingencies if they encountered trouble. It was a grim but necessary conversation, both of them acutely aware of the stakes. Rest now, Thomas said finally. Need strength for days ahead. Rebecca nodded, though she doubted sleep would come easily with her mind racing. As Thomas rose to leave, she called after him. What did the council learn about Blackwell's whereabouts? How close is he? Thomas hesitated, clearly debating whether to share this information. 1 day's ride southwest. Camp near trading post called Peterson's Outpost. So close, Rebecca whispered, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. Yes. Thomas's expression was solemn. Why we leave different directions? Use Dakota paths through hills. He studied her face. Are you afraid? It would have been easy to lie, to pretend bravery she didn't entirely feel, but Rebecca had learned that honesty between them was more valuable than pride. Yes, she admitted, but not enough to turn back. Fear is useful only if it makes you act, remember? Thomas nodded, recognition flickering in his eyes at her reference to her father's teaching. Good fear makes feet quick, eyes sharp. Bad fear makes heart freeze. He adjusted his pack. Your fear is good. With that assessment, he departed, leaving Rebecca to prepare herself for what might be the most dangerous journey of her life. The final moments of that night would forever remain etched in Rebecca's memory, the whispered farewells as the Dakota camp prepared to disperse, the solemn gravity of the 4 warriors who would accompany them, the unexpected embrace from singing Bird, who pressed a small medicine pouch into her hands before melting away into the pre-dawn darkness. As they set out under a sky still studded with stars, Rebecca felt something unexpected taking root within her. Not just the will to survive that had kept her alive since the massacre, but something richer and more complex. The courage to build bridges between worlds that had developed in isolation from one another. The carved bear that Thomas had given her rested against her chest, suspended on a leather thong around her neck, a symbol of the transformation that had only just begun, a reminder that sometimes we find our true purpose not in the life we planned, but in the one that finds us when everything else has fallen away. As the rising sun cast long shadows across the prairie that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her a new purpose, Rebecca Wilson, once a Boston schoolteacher's daughter bound for Oregon, now something altogether different, rode beside Thomas Eagle Feather toward a future neither of them could fully envision, a future that might, against all odds, help heal the growing rift between two peoples locked in a cycle of suspicion and violence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.